At Auschwitz-Birkenau, the first encounter with death did not begin inside a sealed chamber. It began on a platform of dirt and gravel, beside rails that cut into the camp like an open vein. When the train stopped, the air filled with screaming, with orders, with dogs, with the dull thud of rifle butts against wood. The doors swung open, and the crowd descended carrying whatever they could, disoriented, not yet knowing that this moment of confusion was, in fact, the most decisive moment of all. In that first minute, everything was reduced to a quick glance and a verdict with no appeal. Work, waiting, or immediate disappearance. At that exact point, where confusion became method, operated a SS physician who had turned selection into a habit as precise as a signature. Josef Mengele did not function as an isolated scientist in a laboratory removed from the horror. He functioned as a piece designed to fit inside the machinery of the complex, with direct access to transports, with authority over vulnerable prisoners, with facilities at hand, and with a routine that repeated itself transport after transport without wearing down. What happened in his experiments was not an accident or an aberration. It was a circuit integrated into the Auschwitz system, sustained by records, by forced assistance, and by an obsessive logic of human classification that the camp fed every time a train arrived. What follows traces the real route, from the selection on the ramp to what happened behind closed doors, the suffering that circuit imposed, and why so few came out alive. The invisible route, from the ramp to the medical barracks. Auschwitz was not a single place, it was a complex. Auschwitz-I, the main camp, built on the hard discipline of a military barracks converted into a prison. Birkenau, Auschwitz-II, vast and waterlogged, the space where extermination reached its maximum scale and where death became industrial. Monowitz, Auschwitz III, with its network of factories and slave labor, where the body was demanded as though it were a replaceable gear. Within that map, there also existed a medical structure of the SS that was not designed to heal prisoners. It was designed to manage the labor supply, to control epidemics when they threatened productivity, and to uphold, dressed in a white coat, the system of selection and death. Within that structure, the chief physician of the complex held formal authority over the medical sections. Under that authority worked various SS doctors, each with assigned functions, shifts, and zones. That framework is essential because the experiments did not take place in an improvised vacuum. They were built on top of a camp that had already converted the human body into an operational category. A body could be labor, a statistical figure, laboratory material, or simple waste. Those categories were not debated. They were applied. Mengele arrived at Auschwitz in 1943 and slotted himself into that machinery with the ease of someone who recognizes the instrument they have been looking for. He did not need to invent the system. He found it running and put it to use. His presence became especially visible at one point that concentrated all the power of the camp. The ramp at Birkenau. There, in the space of a few meters of packed earth, the instant of selection determined the fate of every new arrival. And in that instant, Mengele was looking for something that held no value for the camp's labor economy, but sat at the center of his obsession. Specific groups of people chosen not for their strength, but for their biology. The procedure on the ramp was fast and brutal, but it was not chaotic. There was an imposed order that repeated itself with the precision of a rehearsed protocol. First, separating men from women and children, then a line advancing in front of the physicians. Most of those arriving did not understand the language of the orders. Interpretation came through screams, gestures, and blows. A hand pointed left or right with a movement that could last less than a second. In that minimal gesture, everything was concentrated. One side led to registration and the barracks, the other to the path that ended at the extermination facilities. Within that mechanism, the medical selection was not a clinical examination. It was an instantaneous assessment of usefulness. A young adult, without visible signs of weakness, could be assigned to labor. An elderly person, a child, a mother with several small children, someone the journey had already broken, was discarded. That logic existed before Mengele arrived. He exploited it to open a third route, far narrower and quieter. The route of those pulled aside for the laboratory. The victims who interested him most fit a clear profile. Twins. People with dwarfism, individuals with unusual physical traits. On occasion, family groups with particular characteristics that his classificatory obsession would convert into cases. On the ramp, amid the noise and chaos of arrival, certain words could be heard. Words some survivors would recall decades later with near photographic clarity. The order to separate twins. It was repeated insistently at times, in multiple languages, like a hook cast over the crowd. And when someone responded, when a child raised their hand, when a father pushed his children forward out of fear of being left behind, that involuntary gesture could alter their immediate fate. It was not salvation. It was capture. That point is essential to understanding how the circuit functioned. The experiment did not begin in any barracks or on any examination table. It began at selection. The camp was a constant source of newly arrived human beings, weakened by the transport, disoriented, and with no capacity for organized resistance. For an SS doctor with a methodical obsession, that flow was an unlimited supply. For the victims, it was a trap with no markings. Once separated from the crowd, the selected groups did not follow the path of ordinary registration, nor the path of immediate death. They were held in a controlled limbo, visible only to those who were part of the circuit. In that stretch, the camp revealed another of its faces, the ability to move people without leaving any trace visible to the rest. They were removed from the crowd's line of sight with quiet efficiency. They were transferred under escort. They were concentrated in specific zones where they could be observed, measured, photographed, inventoried. At Birkenau, that route ended in barracks attached to the medical sector. What waited inside bore no resemblance to what the phrase medical barracks might suggest from the outside. No medicine of survival operated there. No logic of relief. What operated was an administration of the body. The first step was registration, and that registration was far more than a name. The system needed numbers, files, and categories that could later be aligned in comparable columns. Ages, origins, family relationships, languages, visible markings on the body. The central goal was to confirm that twins were genuinely twins. Traits were compared, bodies were measured. In a camp where everything was numbered, the experiment had its numbering too. At the same time, the transfer to those barracks constructed a dangerous illusion for some. While death on the ramp was immediate for many, being pulled aside by a physician could feel like an unexpected turn, even a momentary reprieve. That illusion was part of the mechanism, not a side effect. The real purpose was never explained. Nothing was disclosed. Obedience was enforced through fear, confusion, and isolation, and uncertainty was left to do the rest. The isolation was constant and deliberate. Those selected for experimentation were separated from the general life of the camp. They did not attend the same work assignments. They did not follow the same routines. They did not move through the same paths. That had a precise purpose. Control over the body requires total control over the environment. A prisoner who talks too freely, who circulates, who tells others what they saw, becomes a liability. At Birkenau, secrecy was a first-order tool, and the medical sector operated as a space of secrecy within the larger secret of the camp. Mengele did not work alone. No SS physician operated without assistance. At Auschwitz, prisoner medical personnel existed and were forced to carry out functions under SS orders with no possibility of refusal. Nurses, orderlies, lab assistants, clerks, interpreters. That group was used as internal labor. They performed functions ranging from transporting bodies to maintaining the registry, preparing instruments, and executing direct tasks that the SS preferred not to carry out with their own hands. It was another form of efficiency. The SS could maintain physical distance from the most brutal daily work while still controlling every step. The circuit was also sustained by an element that ran through the entire complex like a nervous system. Documentation. Auschwitz recorded, classified, filed. The Nazi administration, built on an obsession with order and figures, needed to convert every body into manageable data. That appears across every layer of the camp. Transport lists, head counts, files, barracks notations. In the case of the experiments, documentation acquired an additional dimension, because it had to convert violence into procedure. A written page could transform a brutal act into a line item on an official report with a date, a number, and a signature. But documentation was not only paper. There was also visual record keeping. Prisoners were forced to photograph in contexts determined exclusively by the SS. It was not a free camera. It was a tool of the system with its own rules of use. And although not everything was photographed, the very existence of that apparatus revealed the general logic of the circuit. Measure, compare, test, preserve evidence. The experiment did not end when the physician stepped out. It continued in the archives. At the center of Mengele's routine was comparison. In twins, that comparison became the dominant obsession that organized everything else. The goal was not to observe a single person, but to set two bodies considered identical against each other and extract the differences that racial ideology could convert into proof. That idea, carried into practice, required keeping twins alive long enough to repeat measurements, examinations, and procedures again and again. And so, within the general horror consuming most people at Birkenau, twins could at certain moments receive differentiated treatment, not out of compassion, out of operational utility. That distinction, however, did not reduce the violence. It only changed its form. Instead of a rapid death on the ramp, a chain of interventions, controls, and tests was imposed that could stretch across weeks or months. To keep that chain running, the camp assigned them their own space and routine. They were counted regularly. They were called by number, never by name. They were assembled for collective reviews in rooms that could change from one session to the next. Sometimes inspection happened inside the barracks, without prior notice. That irregularity was part of the terror. There was no stable schedule that allowed for any mental preparation for what was coming. The order could fall at any moment of the day. The door could open at any hour. Numbers could be called out in the middle of the night. And then the entire barracks rose as though the air had suddenly thickened. What appeared repeatedly in the memories of those who survived was a concrete image. Mengele as a physical presence. Not merely as a physician, but as someone who chose visibly, who walked the space, who watched with an attention he made no effort to conceal. Unlike other officers who operated from behind chains of intermediaries, he showed up in the decisive places. That presence fed something specific in the minds of prisoners. The sense that fate was personal, that there was a directed intention aimed at them, even though everything was part of a circuit that would have functioned the same way under another operator. The circuit was not limited to measurements and extractions. It also encompassed more invasive interventions, presented under the neutral language of procedure and protocol, but carried out without consent, and for purposes that had no relationship to medicine, as a discipline oriented toward human well-being. Substances with unpredictable effects were administered. Pathological conditions were induced in order to observe reactions. Tests were repeated until the body was exhausted. In some cases, work was performed on specific physical traits with the goal of modifying them or documenting their limits. Each of those lines of inquiry answered to the same underlying premise: that the camp was a laboratory without restrictions, and that those restrictions had ceased to exist the moment its victims lost their rights. One of the most extensively documented areas within that universe was the fixation on pigmentation, iris color, and other visible traits classifiable within the language of the Reich's racial theories. That type of intervention had a logic that was only possible inside an ideological system that had already converted biology into hierarchy. A visible detail of the body, easily catalogued, elevated to the status of scientific proof. In any institution with functioning ethical standards, that line of work would have been rejected before it began. At Auschwitz, it became practice because power allowed any hypothesis to be converted into action on a captive body. For that practice to be sustained, the system needed one final piece: the internal bureaucracy that gave it the shape of a project. Birkenau ran on lists. Barracks lists, transport lists, sick lists, death lists. In the medical sector, the lists defined who was called, who returned, who disappeared from the registry without anyone in the rest of the camp receiving an explanation. And those silent disappearances, which did not follow the visible patterns of the camp, generated a specific fear toward the circuit, the fear of what was happening behind those doors with no witnesses on the other side. In that climate, rumor functioned as a parallel information system. Prisoners in the Revier listened. They saw someone return with a fresh bandage and a different look in their eyes. They saw someone else not return. They saw a forced assistant come out of a session unable to hold his gaze steady. And from those scattered fragments, The mind reconstructed what no one said aloud. At Birkenau, silence was an active tool of control. But silence, even the most sustained, always had cracks. Mengele's circuit also depended on the camp's ability to move bodies internally, according to operational convenience. From one barracks to another, from the revier to an examination room, from an examination room to an isolated block outside the normal flow of traffic. That movement was fundamental. It allowed victims to be kept separated from the rest of the camp, while simultaneously keeping active cases close at hand, at the exact moment the procedure required them. The circuit was not administratively disconnected from the outside world either. Real links existed with scientific institutions of the Reich, which were expecting reports, data, and material. That connection reinforced the logic of an institutionally backed project. This was not directionless barracks brutality. It was brutality sustained by a chain of academic interest, by an ideology that needed evidence, and by a bureaucratic apparatus that converted horror into official correspondence with a letterhead and a stamp. That explained Mengele's persistence on the ramp. Every new transport was an opportunity to expand the archive. A pair of twins could be the focus of weeks of procedures. A person with unusual traits could become a long-term measurement series. For the system, the arrival of victims was not only labor or bodies for the gas chambers. It was supply for the laboratory. And at Birkenau, supply arrived on schedule. Yet that routine had a limit, and the limit was not moral. It was operational. The camp was riddled with disease, with overcrowding the system itself produced, with malnutrition the system itself imposed. Keeping experimental subjects alive became increasingly difficult as general conditions deteriorated. Because of that, within the circuit, a double and contradictory administration existed. Sustain the cases long enough to complete the sequence, and discard those who stopped generating usable data. That discarding could arrive with a speed that destroyed any illusion of continuity. One day a pair was measured and recorded with precision. The next, one could deteriorate irreversibly. The experiment did not stop for that, it adjusted. The deterioration was documented as though it were just another phase of the process. Information was extracted through the final stretch as far as it could go. And when the body stopped producing data, the camp had mechanisms available to eliminate it quickly. At Auschwitz, those exits existed for everything. For exhausted labor, for inconvenient illness, for efficient punishment, for the laboratory, too. That is the point where the circuit becomes completely legible in its logic. The experiments were not a strange appendage of the camp, an aberration within an aberration. They were a coherent extension of the same principle that sustained everything else. Use bodies until they are no longer useful, and then eliminate them. The difference was the type of usefulness. Instead of dragging stones or carrying bags, the usefulness was producing data, comparisons, samples, observations that an ideology needed to convert into science. And while that circuit advanced, a question had begun to grow inevitable. Silent in the barracks and the corridors and in the eyes of those who had already seen too much. What happened when the experiment ended? What happened when the physician already had what he was looking for? What happened when the war approached from the east? When the camp began to tighten from within? When the system that had operated as a perfect mechanism began to need to erase the traces of its own perfection? The answer to that question did not arrive in a single form. It arrived in several, each one depending on a different calculation. When the experiment determined it had extracted what it was seeking, the subject entered a zone without a name. Not the zone of labor, nor the zone of ordinary waiting. It was the margin, and at Auschwitz, the margin had no fixed duration. It could last a day or several weeks, but it always ended at the same point. When someone decided that the body was no longer generating new information, the body ceased to matter as a resource. And what ceased to matter as a resource moved into a different circuit. That transition was not always abrupt. Sometimes it announced itself through a shift in routine. The summons grew less frequent. The reviews stopped occurring. The pair of twins would go days without being called. And that absence could feel like relief, because in the camp, invisibility was sometimes protection. But in the medical circuit, invisibility meant something else. That there was no longer any reason to administer them differently. They became ordinary prisoners, with everything that implied at Birkenau. And Birkenau, stripped of the function of experimental resource, was a place where the body burned out quickly, There was another, more direct ending. There were cases where the process concluded with an intervention that was not meant to observe or measure, but to finalize. In the cold language of the system, that meant eliminating the subject once there was no longer utility in keeping them alive. Injections were used. Methods were used that the camp had available for rapid death. Spaces were cleared so they could be filled by new arrivals coming in on the transports. The camp's efficiency left no room for idle occupancy. Everything was reused, including the barracks. Those deaths were not entirely invisible either. They left a trace in the internal bureaucracy, a figure on a list, a number that would not appear in the next head count. The system needed control, even over the death it produced. And so, paradoxically, some of those endings were recorded, not as crimes, as data. The forced assistants knew. The prisoner physicians who sustained the internal operations of the revier carried that knowledge like an invisible stone. They had watched bodies arrive and had watched the conclusion of the processes. They could not refuse without becoming the next victim. They could not speak without disappearing. They lived trapped inside a contradiction, the camp manufactured with precision, making them participants in order to make them complicit, and turning that forced complicity into one more link in the chain of silence. Some of those assistants survived, and what they carried for decades was not only memory, it was also the weight of having sustained, with their own hands, a portion of the machinery. Not by choice, not through simple cowardice, but because the camp had converted survival into a trap shaped like a task. In the testimonies that came later, that weight appeared with a kind of honesty that was difficult to hear. They did not describe what they did as heroism, nor did they minimize it. They described it as what it was. What happens when a system forces victims to participate in their own destruction? Meanwhile, Mengele's circuit continued functioning as long as the camp continued receiving transports. And the transports, well into 1,944, arrived with a regularity that defied any comprehension from the outside. In the summer of that year, convoys from Hungary arrived at a pace that overwhelmed even Birkenau's capacity. In that context, selection on the ramp accelerated further, and the volume of victims passing through that point turned the laboratory into an unrelenting search through thousands of people. What that meant for the victims was that the system made no distinction between the individual and the mass. For a physician obsessed with specific categories, the mass arrival was an opportunity for scale. For the families stepping off the train, it was the start of the final procedure. And the fact that one of their members was pulled aside did not save them. It only displaced them into a different circuit of destruction. There were children who survived the camp longer than their parents because they were twins and the experiment needed them. There were siblings who watched the other deteriorate, be subjected to procedures, be returned carrying new marks, and could do nothing. The system understood that keeping pairs together was part of the control. The threat against one was a means of controlling the other. It did not need to be said. It was understood without words. By late 1944, something in the camp had begun to shift in tone. Not suddenly, but gradually, the way the temperature of a room drops 1 degree per hour until the cold becomes impossible to ignore. The sounds of the Eastern Front arrived like a distant rumor growing closer. Guards listened, prisoners listened, even the SS physicians listened. And in that listening, the camp began to show a face it had kept hidden. That of a system that could plan meticulously but had not planned for its own collapse. The Nazi administration's response was the one it had always defaulted to: attempt to erase. Destructions accelerated. Records were burned. Installations were demolished. Forced evacuations were ordered. And those evacuations, known to history as the death marches, added another layer to the horror. Thousands of already weakened prisoners, forced to walk through winter without adequate food, under the watch of guards who shot anyone who fell. The camp that had killed with mechanical efficiency ended by killing with the chaos of a retreat. In that context, the medical circuit also entered a liquidation mode. What could not be moved, vanished. What could be moved, moved. Mengele, before Soviet forces reached Auschwitz in January 1945, left the camp. He did not flee in the chaos. He departed with time to spare. He took with him notes, documentation, samples. In his mind, the laboratory's work did not end with the camp. It would continue if the camp disappeared somewhere else. That escape was made possible because the system that had sustained him also protected him in its collapse. SS officers had roots, they had contacts, they had documents that could be altered, and they had something many prisoners had never possessed: time to think about the next step. Mengele passed through various points in Europe before disappearing into South America, where he lived for decades under changed identities, with the quiet support of networks built by ex-Nazis who assisted one another. Meanwhile, those who remained in Auschwitz when the Soviet troops entered were the ones the camp had left behind because they had no transport value. The weakest, the sickest, those who could no longer walk. They were also, for the most part, the only direct witnesses the system had not been able to silence. Their bodies were the most brutal evidence. Visible bones, wounds that had not closed, eyes that registered the presence of someone different but could no longer react with certainty. Among them were children who had passed through the medical circuit, twins who had survived the experiments and the evacuation because, in the final rush, the camp left them behind with all the others. Those children watched Soviet soldiers enter and did not immediately understand what it meant. Some had spent so long inside the system that the world outside had stopped being a concrete image. All they had was the present, the camp, the barracks, the summons, the bowl, the line. The soldiers who entered were not prepared for what they found. They had seen war. They had seen death face to face. But the scale of Auschwitz, its organization, its warehouses packed with stacked clothing, with shoes, with eyeglasses, with cut hair stored in bulk, with the personal belongings of millions of people, had no equivalent in any previous experience. The camp was not a consequence of the war. It was a parallel industry that had operated while the war was happening, and that depended on the war only insofar as the war supplied it with victims. The testimonies from those first days of January 1945 are fragmentary because the impact disorganized language itself. Soldiers tried to describe what they were seeing and words failed them. Survivors tried to speak, and their bodies did not always cooperate. What remained was a collection of images that human memory attempted to process for decades without fully succeeding. Auschwitz was not something one understood after seeing it. It was something one carried. In the months and years that followed, the work of reconstruction began work that no amount of destruction had been able to make complete. Partially burned records, documents that certain people had risked their lives to hide or remove, the testimonies of survivors, collected with varying degrees of urgency and rigor depending on the country, the moment, and the institution, and also the materials of the camp itself, items that remained buried or abandoned, resisting the logic of erasure because the erasure had never been total. Mengele did not appear at the major Nuremberg trials. His name appeared on lists. His history was known to those who had survived his procedures. But his body was not available. For years, for decades, the agencies hunting war criminals attempted to follow his trail. A rumor would surface. It would be investigated. The trail would go cold. He lived in Brazil, in Argentina, in Paraguay, moving according to circumstance, sustained by networks and by silences that certain people chose to maintain. That prolonged impunity was another form of harm for the survivors of the medical circuit. They had not only endured what they had endured, they had to watch as the man directly responsible for that circuit continued living without being held to account, without appearing before anything or anyone. And in that contrast, in the distance between the horror they had lived and the ordinary life of the perpetrator, one of the oldest questions the 20th century has yet to finish answering was concentrated. What does a society do with evil when evil escapes its formal reach? In 1979, Mengele died in Brazil from a vascular episode while swimming in the ocean. He was never captured, never tried, never faced any tribunal. His death was almost domestic. And when it was confirmed, years later, through identification of remains, there were survivors who received the news as something that had arrived too late to change anything real. What they had lived through did not depend on his being judged for it to be true. It had always been true. What changed with the confirmation of his death was, perhaps, only the knowledge that they would never now be able to look him in the face in a room with light and tell him what he had done, and to whom. The twins who survived the Auschwitz circuit carried their marked bodies for the rest of their lives. Some did not speak for decades. Others spoke from the beginning and were not heard, because the post-war world had a limited capacity to absorb the scale of what had occurred. Some found their brothers and sisters after liberation. Others never learned what had become of the other half that the camp had used as an instrument of comparison. That loss, which was not simply the loss of a person, but the loss of half of oneself, had a dimension. The ordinary vocabulary of grief was not built to cover. Over time, some of those survivors began to come together, to speak, to document. They formed organizations. They gave testimony in schools, in universities, before cameras, before judges in proceedings that came decades too late. They were not doing it to obtain retroactive justice, because they had long understood that justice in its full form was not achievable at that scale. They were doing it because the most important experiment they could counter was the one waged against memory, because the system that had captured them had counted, from the beginning, on no one surviving to tell. The science that Mengele claimed to practice was not science. The data produced at Auschwitz under torture had no valid methodological value. The post-war scientific community had to contend with that uncomfortable inheritance. Material produced under conditions no ethical framework could validate, collected by someone who held total power over the bodies and no limits over the procedures. Whether that material could be used or whether using it amounted to a continuation of the original harm had no single answer. But the question itself revealed something important: that science without ethics is not science. It is violence with technical terminology. What remains of Birkenau, of the medical barracks, of the ramp, of the route that ran from the arrival of the train to the sector where the body was converted into a subject of experimentation, are physical remnants, written testimony, and the living memory of those who can still speak. The camp structures, partially preserved, are not museums in any ordinary sense. They are sites where the ground holds layers of history that cannot be separated from what that ground witnessed. Walking those paths does not illustrate. It demands an answer. And in that demand lies the reason for remembering this specific circuit with precision. Not only the mass extermination, not only the gas chambers, not only the numbers, also this. Also the physician who chose on the ramp. Also the barracks where the body was converted into data. Also the forced assistants who kept the mechanism running with their own hands. Also the children who waited to be called without knowing precisely for what, but who had already learned that uncertainty at Auschwitz was always more dangerous than any certainty. That level of detail does not exist to produce additional horror. It exists because the mechanism can only be understood if it is followed all the way to its end. Because the question of how it was possible cannot be answered with a sentence about abstract evil. It is answered by tracing the chain. A law that separated, a bureaucracy that catalogued, a train that transported, a ramp where someone chose, a barracks where the body was reduced to an object, and a flight that lasted decades. Every link in that chain was sustained by specific people who made specific decisions, some acting from ideological conviction, others from functional indifference, others from fear, others from the comfort of those who obey, because obeying is easier than resisting. That distribution of responsibility does not dilute the crime. It amplifies it, because it shows that horror does not need to be monolithic to function. It can be distributed across shifts, across tasks, across signatures at the bottom of an order, across glances that look away at precisely the right moment. In the final testimonies of Auschwitz twins who survived well into the 21st century, something appears that is difficult to describe without diminishing it. It is not only the account of what they endured, it is the insistence that they be remembered as people, not as victims of experiments. That before the ramp there was a life, a neighborhood, a school, a family with ordinary conversations and plans that included nothing of what came afterward. That insistence is not a sentimental gesture. It is a correction to the narrative the camp attempted to impose, that they were material, that they were data, that they were numbers. They were not. They were people captured by a system that needed to convert them into something else in order to do what it did. And that conversion, that reduction, that stripping away of name and voice and future was the precondition for everything that followed. Remembering them as people does not undo the horror. It places the horror where it belongs. Not in an abstract territory where evil operates without faces, but in the concrete history of decisions made by human beings against other human beings. There, in that concreteness, lies the only possible answer to the machinery. Not in revenge, not in forgetting, in the persistent reconstruction of every name, every route, every internal mechanism, every link. so that what was designed to leave no trace does not have that victory. So that the ramp, the corridor, the barracks, and the end of that circuit remain a fact with dates, with places, and with people, and do not dissolve into the silence the system tried to install from the very beginning.